After almost a whole year, the leaders of the two most powerful countries in the world met each other on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco. President Joseph Biden met his counterpart, Chinese paramount leader Xi Jinping, to discuss the trajectory of bilateral relationship in the past year and also look at ways to make sure that the two most powerful nations in the world do not sleepwalk into conflict. The past year was not easy for the two superpowers. After an encouraging meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali last year, bilateral relationship actually took a turn for the worse. To begin with, there was the Chinese spy balloon, a balloon that the Americans had to shut down and which created a lot of tensions in bilateral relations and prevented high-level diplomatic exchanges. In fact, Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled his visit to Beijing earlier this year in response to the spy balloon scandal. But China also had its own grievances, including American sanctions against its top officials and national champions and high-tech companies. Nevertheless, in the latter part of the year, there was a gradual effort by both sides to mend ties. There was a visit by top American officials to Beijing, not to mention visits by top corporate titans of the United States to Beijing. And at the same time, President Xi Jinping of China also welcomed more and more direct engagement with the Americans until his visit to San Francisco. In terms of the tone of the summit, there was a lot to be optimistic about. President Xi Jinping of China signaled that it wants to be a friend rather than rival of the United States, and President Biden acknowledged that there should be guardrails in the bilateral relationship, the most consequential of the 21st century. Despite some agreements on relatively low-hanging issues, and not to mention the acknowledgement by both sides that they have to focus more on cooperation rather than competition, the reality is that the U.S.-China relationship is not going to get easier in the coming year or so. There's going to be U.S. elections where you can expect that the top candidates from each party will adopt increasingly hawkish stance towards China. There's also, of course, disagreements over U.S. tech sanctions against China and rising tensions in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, East China Sea, and over Taiwan, among many other issues. So what is the future of American policy in Asia? And what is the best way for the United States to deal with the China challenge? We have a special guest today to discuss that from an American perspective. Joining us tonight is author and senior defense analyst at RAND Corporation, Derek Grossman. Good evening. I must add, also influencer, quite someone very influential on Twitter, among others. Nice to have you, Derek.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Richard.
much.
Yeah.
All right, now, we have had all sorts of different guests from different perspectives, different countries. But I want to get the American perspective of this, non-partisan American perspective on this. So recently, there was another meeting between President Biden and paramount leader of China, Xi Jinping, and people are wondering to what degree was it a success and to what degree not necessarily a success. What is your general assessment of that San Francisco posh mansion place meeting? Yeah.
Well, like most things, Richard, I think it's kind of a mixed bag, right? So on the one hand, from a process perspective, it's always good to communicate with your competitor or your adversary, depending on how you characterize China, right? So communication at the highest of levels between Biden and Xi, I think, was a welcome development. You always learn from your rival when you speak to them. They may be surprised at certain things you bring up. You may kind of gauge their, you may kind of learn things about their plans and intentions during the course of a conversation. So I think that was a good thing, but it's, I think, to be determined whether some of the policy deliverables from the meeting will actually translate into real Chinese action on issues of concern to the United States. I mean, we saw the agreement on fentanyl, to limit the amount of chemicals that China was producing in order to produce fentanyl, right? So they had already done some action on that prior to the summit. You could argue, well, they were preparing to deliver on that deliverable, or maybe they were already doing something so that they didn't have to do other things, right? So we don't know. On the mill-to-mill communication part, again, good to talk to your rival, but let's be honest, there's been a telephone line between the Pentagon and the Ministry of Defense for many, many years now. Right. The problem is when there's an incident in the Indo-Pacific,
no one's on the other side.
Nobody picks up the phone. That's the issue, right? So are they going to pick up the phone in the future? And I should also mention that in the last 48 hours or so since the meeting, right, you have the Chinese continuing to conduct incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and also conducting naval combat support drills, right? So I mean, that activity is continuing. So a lot of it is kind of to be determined, to be honest.
Right. I mean, my understanding is that there was perhaps some understanding that the median line between Taiwan and China, which China has been, the PLA Air Force has been violating consistently since the Nancy Pelosi visit. Perhaps there'll be some, retrenchment on that by China. So a number of supposedly low-hanging fruit issues, the fentanyl issue, the median line, among others, were supposedly discussed. But my point is, realistically, I mean, Biden has claimed that he has spent more than 70 hours directly with Xi Jinping since
the most of any president.
Vice president, traveled 17,000 miles. There's all of that discussion about Biden saying, I have spent more time with this gentleman than anyone else. But one of the things we also notice here, or perhaps this is a non-American reading, is that it looks like Xi Jinping was the one who was like the more dovish in terms of rhetoric. And President Biden was a little bit more guarded and saying, we're here for the guardrails, but we have to be realistic. Is that a proper reading? And especially with U.S. elections coming in and China bashing, I think is going to be the trend, perhaps next year in the elections. Did you see some sort of difference in the cadence of the leaders?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think both leaders tried to play it as safe as possible, right? So when you look at Xi Jinping's speech to business leaders at APEC, he talked about how China does not seek to surpass the United States in global power. They do not seek a sphere of influence. They will never look to start a war, right? But when you look at past words and actions from that same leader, Xi Jinping, that's not the types of things that he has been saying and doing in the past.
I mean,
right?
I remember with President Obama, he promised not to militarize
the Spratly Islands.
This is 2015, if I'm not mistaken, and yet,
Yeah. So I mean, so Xi Jinping certainly was kind of putting on a warmer face for the meeting, and by the same token, President Biden, when talking about Taiwan, only mentioned the 3 communiques rather than adding on the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances as being part and parcel of our one China policy and our cross-strait policy. And so I think if you're sitting in Taipei right now, you kind of look at that with some trepidation. Right. But again, they were trying to tone down the differences and play up the cooperative aspects of the relationship, as narrow as that window may be.
Right. In 2015, there was this meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Obama, and quite explicitly, from what we get in reports, President Xi Jinping said they're not going to militarize those fake islands they've been building since December 2013, and yet the complete opposite of that happened. So what can we make out of this even dovish conversations and all the tens of hours that Biden has spoken with China? Does it even make sense? Is there any value to this kind of conversations?
Well, I think both leaders certainly tried to play down their differences and play up the cooperative aspects of the bilateral relationship, as narrow as that spectrum may be for cooperation. Xi Jinping gave a speech to business leaders at APEC in which he talked about how China does not seek a sphere of influence, does not seek to surpass the United States in power, does not seek to have a Cold War or a hot war. But the reality is, since the APEC summit, we have already seen that the Chinese continue to conduct incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, as well as conduct naval preparatory drills in order to either threaten the island or to actually attack the island. Although I don't think that's in the cards, but you never know, right? And so that those types of activities continue apace following the APEC summit. So we need to take that into consideration when we look at Xi Jinping's words at the actual summit.
So guarded expectation. Before we go to the really intractable issues, South China Sea, which is close to our heart in the case of the Philippines, and then of course Taiwan, which Philippines is increasingly relevant too because of our location and everything with EDCA. Let's first talk about the relatively low-hanging fruits, or the things that may work. Let's talk about the military-to-military diplomacy. I mean, one of the concerns that has been raised, especially earlier this year, I think in the Shangri-La dialogue, some folks in the region raised the issue, which is, China tends to weaponize dialogue as a leverage point, when in fact it should be an SOP, right? I mean, how do you make sure that you don't give China the initiative to take advantage of your willingness to be the adult in the room, for that matter, right? I mean, is this a real challenge, or do you think this is just a temporary, desperate tactic by China while they're figuring out how to deal with Biden?
Yeah, well, I think they have been using suspension of mill-to-mill dialogue as a weapon, as you say, for many years now. I mean, I recall when I was a daily intelligence briefer at the Pentagon way back in 2014, and the Chinese had suspended mill-to-mill over, I think, the latest Taiwan arms sale that we had done.
Right.
And policymakers were kind of apoplectic at the time about that and wondering when mill-to-mill would come back on. And it was offline for, I think it was something like 9 or 12 months, right? And so China knows that by suspending that mill-to-mill communication, it is viewed in Washington as a punishment, as a penalty, right? And then we need to kind of claw back, do everything in our power to try to get that mechanism back on. And what we saw after the Biden-Xi summit is that mill-to-mill is back on, right? But it's really about process, right? The defense consultative talks in particular, it'll be a more routinized thing where we interact with our Chinese counterparts. But at the end of the day, what matters is, are they picking up that phone when an incident occurs?
Right.
And that is still a very, very much an unknown. And if past is the future, it's unlikely that they are picking up that phone in an emergency.
Right. I mean, the other issue, of course, a supposed shared concern is climate change, right? This is something that John Kerry has been very strong about. The special envoys are for climate change negotiation. But even there, sometimes you feel that China's forcing, this issue linkage game they play. It's like, I'm not sure I want to help you in climate change. You're giving us a lot of headache here. I mean, again, how do you realistically and responsibly and from an optics standpoint approach this issue without giving China the initiative, even on the climate change issue, which is supposed to be a global universal concern?
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese have said that it is a global universal concern. However, they've also played politics with climate change. So if we do something in the past, certain actions we have taken vis-a-vis Taiwan, they have said, well, we're not going to cooperate with you on climate change unless or until you cease and desist on Taiwan, right? And so that has become a major point for us to show that you're not being, that China is not being genuine in its intentions to deal with climate change. And oh, by the way, we got back into the Paris Climate Change Accord, right? And climate change is still something that we are struggling to cooperate with China on. And so it's something that I think China is going to increasingly have trouble explaining as part of its propaganda, why it does not cooperate with the United States and the global community on climate change in the way that it should.
Well, at the federal level, but we saw Xi Jinping having this very chummy exchanges with your governor in California, who some consider as potentially the next presidential for the Democratic Party. I mean, it seems to be one of the big figures there. The interaction seems very friendly. There was an invitation. It's back and forth, even on the sidelines of the APEC summit. Of course, California is strong on transition to more climate change transportation system, on electric vehicles. It has a kind of a gold standard for legislation in some way. Is there a concern that China may try to play that game, investing in the future, go at the state level? Because it has a track record of trying to manipulate countries, but if you cannot get the guy in the capital or in the imperial capital, maybe you can work it through other. I mean, do you think that could happen? And not to mention the big tech companies, Elon Musk going big in terms of Tesla investments, Tim Cook, still big Apple investments. You think China is also thinking, maybe the guy in the White House, we may not have necessarily understanding, but we have other vectors of influence and engagement we can weaponize?
This is classic United Front tactics on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And what I mean by that is, if you are feeling that there's a roadblock at the federal level, in particular at the White House, try to find every method possible to get around that roadblock. And one of those methods is going directly to governors, all right? And so we saw my governor of California, Gavin Newsom, visit Beijing. He got the red carpet rollout. He got to meet with Xi Jinping, which I think came as a surprise to many people, not to me, but to many people. And then when Xi came to the APEC summit on the return visit, you saw Governor Newsom there greeting him, and also gave him the Golden State Warriors jersey. And
yes, I
you
saw.
have that now famous picture of Xi Jinping beaming with delight.
Yeah. Well, he's a basketball fan. I mean, I think that was genuine. That was genuine.
Yes, I think that was genuine too.
That was genuine. Yeah.
Okay, but the point is that there's certainly, the Chinese are certainly cultivating a relationship with Governor Newsom. And I think they are doing that to get around the roadblock they see at the White House, but also kind of as a way of preparing for a potential future, as you say.
Investing in the future.
If it is a President Newsom, they have now laid the groundwork to have a positive relationship.
Yeah. And what about the Wall Street and big tech, especially the big tech? I mean, Elon Musk, who owns X, formerly or better known as Twitter, I mean, he's big on China, and I see him is posting, I don't know, Graham Allison's book, which essentially calls for some sort of understanding. I mean, we're seeing that very influential big titans of business coming out in favor of some sort of understanding and compromise with China, whatever that means.
Well, the business community is always gonna want a more cooperative U.S.-China relationship because that helps their bottom line, right? So it's not surprising that Elon Musk is shaking hands with Xi Jinping at the APEC summit as well, because I mean, again, good relations is good for business, okay?
Right.
But the problem I think that people in our line of work have with the business community is that they're not properly taking account of the fact that there are real security concerns with what China is doing, all right, to its, not just internationally, but also to its own people. There are values issues here, what they're doing in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs or the Tibetans, in Hong Kong. I mean, there's lots of examples of it, right? And so we need to, I think, in the United States and in the Philippines, kind of have a moment in which we realize we gotta try to do both. It's got to be a balanced approach.
Kind of juggle the two, the two principles of business. I mean, the reason I'm asking is because, like a few years ago, we were hearing that even Wall Street was souring on China, and with China cracking down on foreign investments, Japanese. I mean, there's whole China plus one strategy, even with Americans. But suddenly you have, this Tim Cooks and, Apple and Tesla, and also, of course, chief of Microsoft. I mean, it looks like while the Wall Street and some other American companies are realistically, looking at China and saying, this is not the same place where we used to invest, there's still some very big players, right, who are directly engaging Xi Jinping, special guests like Kissinger, like our former President Duterte. So, when you're looking at it from the outside, it's like, is this just some sort of innocent diplomacy, multi-vector diplomacy, or maybe something else is going on? Because I remember very well when there was this big meetings between Xi Jinping and the tech titans from the U.S., everyone's saying, but what about the U.S. government? They're not conversing because we know, I mean, after the whole China spy balloon situation until Janet Yellen's visit, there was quite a, communication gap for a while. I'm not blaming the U.S. necessarily for that. And then you had these big business titans coming in, right? So that's the reason why I wanted to emphasize that. But going back again, let's talk about the intractable issues. I think all of this is really the warm-up. Let's go one by one. Let's talk about Taiwan. I mean, the problem with Taiwan, you and I know this, we have been invested in Taiwan issue analytical and otherwise for quite some time, in the sense that you can play a lot of language games around it, right? You can say, each side is essentially pretending that they're still sticking to the status quo, the 1992 consensus, all of the things that was agreed upon from Nixon to Carter. And then each side is saying, because the other side is challenging the status quo, whatever I do is not provocation, it's a legitimate adjustment, right? So you have suddenly this language game of who is changing the status quo. What's up with that? And what I want to also add here is Biden, I'm not sure if this is faux pas because it happened more than once. He kind of implied that there is a de facto mutual defense treaty, not an actual defense treaty, but the Taiwan Relations Act may be sufficient enough to justify American intervention. And the reason I'm asking is because we're in the Philippines. From Manila to Taipei, just over an hour. From Manila to any ASEAN major capital is 3 to 4 hours. So we're actually closer to Taiwan than a lot of our ASEAN neighbors. So what happens in Taiwan is absolutely important to us. What's going on in Taiwan, from an American perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that when we talk about cross-strait relations, we always mention the 3 communiques followed by the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances.
Right.
At APEC, very sort of curiously, Biden dropped off that Taiwan Relations Act and Six Assurances part, again, I think to play up the warmness and cooperative nature of the relationship, right? And now look at the Chinese side. When they were coming to APEC, what did they want? They actually said, we want the United States to say that you categorically oppose Taiwan independence, which is something that we don't say. We usually leave it up to Taiwan to decide what they want to do. Or
behind the scenes, kind of encourage them not to do anything provocative.
And I mean, China has also said recently that the vast majority of the problems they have with the United States relate to Taiwan. Okay, so now I've always kind of looked at the China-Taiwan-U.S. relationship as a triangle, right? And you got to make sure that preferably all sides of that triangle are in good health. Okay, but if two or more sides of that triangle are in poor health, then we have a problem. And right now, definitely two of those sides of the triangle are in bad health, right? So China-Taiwan relations are in bad health, and U.S.-China relations are in bad health. U.S.-Taiwan relations are in great health, but the problem is, as that relationship improves, it worsens the other two sides. All right, and so for me, I'm worried. And plus, we have a January election coming up for president in Taiwan. We have Lai Ching-te, William Lai, who will be the Democratic Progressive Party nominee. And then we have on the Kuomintang side, the KMT side, we have Ho Yo-i.
And they're building a broader coalition, right?
They're attempting to, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen. And so the odds-on favorite is a landslide for Lai. And if you think the Chinese were concerned about Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan, wait till you see what they think about Lai. Because Lai in the past has said that he's a pro-independence supporter or worker of Taiwan.
Although, to be fair to him, I mean, I attended one of his talks the other month, and it looks like, I think, as he's realizing he's getting closer to that position, he seems to have a little, and he had a special interview, I think, also on Bloomberg, among others. My understanding is, I think he's more adopting the Tsai side, but you're correct in a sense that...
but China doesn't forget.
Yes, right. And there are people in the DPP party that are more the pro-independence, Cheng Shu-bian kind of...
I agree with you. I think Beijing should actually realize that the DPP candidates and nominees who then eventually become president, they're actually pretty reasonable.
Yes.
Right, in their positions. But that's not really what they're saying. And it's kind of hard to know whether Beijing's intentionally playing up the issues that they have, or they genuinely think that William Lai is going to declare independence, right? Or something like that. So yeah, all three sides of that triangle preferably should be in good health, and right now, at least two of them are out of whack, and that is causing big problems, I think, in the relationship.
Let's talk about Taiwan, because you know, I was in Europe. I mean, I was actually in the talking to some folks in Northern Europe. You know, some of the neighbors, immediate neighbors of Russia, and I asked one of their head of state, off the record, something like, to what degree is what's happening with Russia relevant to what's happening with Taiwan? And one of the responses I got was very interesting. It was something along the lines that the harder we make this look for Russia, the harder it is for China to consider doing something funny on Taiwan. So there's even this consciousness in Eastern Europe, right, that there is this nexus between the Taiwan question and also the you know, what's happening in Ukraine, among others. Do you think that what's happening in Ukraine right now is encouraging China's temptation to do something massive on Taiwan, or do you think that the Ukraine situation, regardless of how this ends up, because things are still in flux in the Ukraine front, is going to make China think twice, because Taiwan is far more developed and advanced than Ukraine by any measure. I'm never going to doubt their courage should things go down that road. And it's amphibious attack, completely different from the land invasion that Russia had. And it's not like the Chinese weapons are so different from the Soviet-derived Russian weapons. There's a lot of, you know, family resemblance there. To what degree do you think what's happening in Europe may affect Taiwan, or do you think they're completely different and they're not necessarily gonna?
Yeah. So I mean, you already mentioned that China would have to conduct an amphibious landing invasion, and Russia did not, right? So if you look at the history of amphibious landing invasions and their level of success, not very successful for the most
Just
part.
Second World War is the only one you can.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I would say U.S. landing at Incheon, I think, although that was on friendly territory, obviously, right? So, yeah, but generally speaking, not a good history, difficult to pull off, all right? But so kind of from that perspective, yeah, there's definitely differences in, you know, how China's looking at Taiwan versus how it's looking at Russia versus Ukraine. But I also think that the narrative has changed quite significantly, right? So at first, Russia received international condemnation, sanctions from the United States and from allies and partners who were willing to implement those sanctions. U.S. support to the Ukrainian resistance really took a toll on, and I think continues to take a toll on Russia's military operations. But now, in the last, you know, however long, last few months, what we have seen is kind of this stalemate of the conflict and really a reversion to World War I era style warfare, right? Trench warfare. And if you are China, you look at that and you say, and you know, at the same time, U.S. support for the Ukrainian resistance is dwindling. Right? We may have given billions of dollars over the last year and a half and done it in record speed, but now, especially Republicans in the House of Representatives, but also others, are less willing, or maybe unwilling, to provide that level of support or any support,
especially with the new front opening
and
up in the Middle East.
And now you have the Israel-Hamas conflict, and so U.S. resolve is in question. So for China, the lesson is kind of changing. At first, it was be careful what you do because Russia's really suffering a heavy toll. But now it might be something along the lines of, you'll suffer in the beginning, but wait it out, see it through, and eventually time will benefit.
Which was the Putin calculation, right? We're going to wear them out. You know, I mean, even history of Russia, right? They never start the wars very well. First World War, second. But eventually, just the sheer size, a steamroller, right, gets the upper hand over time, or at least creates a stalemate. So what you're saying is that the trajectory, the unfortunate trajectory of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, which is becoming more like First World War than 21st century drone wars, may actually make some think in China that, you know, it's not going to be cheap, it's going to be, you know, bloody, but it's not something totally impossible. I mean, if Republicans keep on blocking the funding for Ukraine, because President Biden, in light of what happened in the Israeli-Gaza conflict, suggested that we'll continue funding Ukraine, but of course Israel is a special ally of the United States. But that also raises the question, I mean, can U.S. be involved in multiple theaters simultaneously? How reasonably? Is it going to be an offshore balancer in one, directly involved in two, offshore balancing? You get what I'm saying? America is a superpower, but this is not 2001. This is not 1990s. This is 2023. Things are looking different, aren't they?
So Biden gave an interview at CBS's 60 Minutes right after the Israel-Hamas conflict began, and one of the questions was, can the United States handle multiple conflicts at the same time? And he said, yes. Now, of course, as President of the United States, you have to say yes, even if it's wrong, right? Or you're being untruthful. You have to say yes, because if you say no, then that makes it sound like
unpatriotic.
Yes, unpatriotic, and we're a declining power, okay, basically, right? So you can't say those things, okay, but so there's that. But then also, we have to consider that President Biden, unlike any of his predecessors, has on 4 separate occasions, when asked if China attacks Taiwan, will the U.S.
4, not 3, actually 4 already.
4 separate occasions.
4.
If China attacks Taiwan, will the U.S. militarily support Taiwan? And he has said yes, without any caveat, clarification, equivocation, nothing, right? And he's been asked to clarify, to follow up, just to make sure that we were hearing him correctly. And he said, yes, we would come to Taiwan's defense. That is something, and the Chinese know this, by the way, even before he made those statements. If you look at Chinese primary source texts from military researchers and others who are involved in military affairs in China, they always assume U.S. intervention. That is why the PLA over the last several decades has been modernizing and professionalizing its fighting force in order to deal with the likely
Right.
scenario in which the
It's
U.S. intervenes.
presupposed,
It's
yeah.
presupposed, right?
Yeah.
So what Biden said was just kind of reaffirming that presupposition from Beijing. So my point is, when you look at Russia, Ukraine never had that expectation. There was never that expectation that the U.S. was going to
Intervene.
intervene militarily for Ukraine.
So you're saying that
So there's a difference.
there's a deterrence element there
Yes.
that was not with Ukraine, because
Absolutely.
actually the Ukraine problem is that they weren't neutral. That's why they were susceptible to Russian invasion. Had they
Absolutely.
been a NATO ally, then they would have been as protected as, I don't know, Lithuania or some of the four smaller and more vulnerable countries, which are probably closer to St. Petersburg than any major Ukrainian city. The other big issue in the US-China relationship is big tech. High tech. And this is again related to Taiwan, semiconductors. Taiwan is responsible for more than 90% of high-tech semiconductors, more than 20% of global processing firepower. It is extremely important country, right? Taiwan goes down, world economy could go down, right? In many ways. Now, speaking of that, how do you assess the Biden administration's approach to the tech sanctions against China? Because this looks like a big issue for the Chinese. But at the same time, China in their latest Huawei phone showed that they somehow can work around it. More than 40% of the inputs for the latest Huawei phone was actually locally sourced, which is, I think, 17% higher than the first generation. This is, I think, the Mate 1, Mate 1, Mate 2. What is your reading on the tech sanction situation? Because this is not as intractable as Taiwan, but it's serious and it's related to Taiwan one way or another.
Yeah, no, I think the Biden administration's approach is to sanction certain sectors of tech, right? Or to limit certain cooperative partnerships on technology with China, because we want to prevent China from using that technology to enhance PLA operations, right? And to enhance their ability to monitor and suppress their,
And to
own,
sabotage
their own people.
critical infrastructure.
Yeah. So now when the whole conversation back in 2021 began with, are we going to decouple from China economically? And now we see this de-risking language out there, right? So we don't want to decouple. We know that we need China as the second largest economy and the number one, trading partner of the United States, and we're their number one trading partner. And we get that, right? We have to maintain an economic relationship, but we have to also find ways to reduce the risk that technology transfers could fall into the wrong hands. And so I think Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen's speech, made a lot of sense in that regard. I think that's what she was trying to say. But then fairly quickly, fairly soon thereafter, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan kind of hammered home the point about the limitations on tech cooperation, right?
What's going on there? Is that like a good cop, bad cop situation? What's going on there?
I actually think that they're more on the same page than it seems.
It's just the language
the
and
way
cadence.
they're speaking is different, right? Because Yellen's perspective is all about, and for that matter, Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, right? Same thing, right? Their job is to kind of promote as much cooperation on the economic side as possible. But then someone like Jake Sullivan's job, or Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State's job, right? Their job is to sort of constrict certain areas in the national security interest, right? And so they're coming at it from different angles, but I actually think they're saying very similar things.
Two sides of the same coin. That's essentially what you're saying. Now, let's go to the last part of this episode, which I think is a mouthful in itself. Philippines. In the Philippines, the rhetoric for quite some time by a lot of people, even up until today, is that this is an alliance that obviously is asymmetrical in every sense of the word, but there's also this idea that America was not there for the Philippines when the mischief reef was taken away in mid-1990s. America was not there when the Scarborough Marshall was taken away. So there's a lot of conversation about America not being reliable. So favorability in America comes up very strongly, way ahead of China, sometimes even 100-point differential. One is plus 70, one is negative 30, right? Net. But when people are asked, has America been as helpful to us, there you see some doubts, which Duterte, our former president, really exploited to the hill. Now, in fairness, from 2019 onwards, we see multiple administrations in the U.S. giving more assurances, etc. which raises another question. Is there a concern in the U.S. that the Philippines might drag you into a conflict with China? This whole Graham Allison school of thought that, if you look at the Peloponnesian War, it was not really Athens and Sparta. It was the mid-range allies dragging Sparta and Athens. Is there that fear that the Philippines, or Japan for that matter, or Taiwan, which we discussed, could drag you into conflict? That you want to be also not sure. You want to also play safe about how you deal with your alliances. That maybe we are the unreliable ally that drags you in. I mean, honestly, is there also a concern like that?
So I've thought a lot about this, and then on my trip here to the Philippines,
Yeah.
I've thought even more about it,
Exactly,
and having these
yeah.
kinds of conversations. And I kind of harken back to the days when I was a daily intelligence briefer, and I remember some of the conversations that were going on. And this was right at the time when China was starting to do land reclamation
Yeah.
and build out the artificial islands and militarize them, right? And there was a lot of talk about how we don't want to be pulled into a potential
Yes.
war, shooting war, over rocks in
Bunch
the ocean.
of rocks, as Obama put it, yeah.
Right, and I think that, could President Obama have done more? Of course, because he did virtually nothing in terms of stopping the land reclamation. So could he have done more? Sure.
What was going on
Right.
there? Sorry, because there's still a lot of debate about what was going on. Why, when December 2013, China starts its thousands of hectares. At first, the language was like, "Oh, it's nothing. We can just bomb it out of existence." And then later on, we realized that maybe the U.S. didn't appreciate what's going on here.
I think there was just a lot of debate about what could be done, and the conclusion was there was nothing viable that could be done. I mean, you could do more patrols, but then that is not going to stop them from dredging necessarily.
Right.
If you try to blockade them, that could be viewed as a hostile act.
And it's
That
not
could-
worth it.
So I think it was just kind of a, forgive me for saying about my own government, but maybe just a lack of creativity on policy options.
Yeah.
And now we're kind of
Caught off guard in a sense.
Yeah, now we're in a far worse situation because through these activities, land reclamation, now all this coercive gray zone activity, China has fundamentally changed the facts
literally changed the
at
facts.
sea, right? And so it's going to be more difficult now to reverse that, right? But So I think a lot of it was just we didn't want to get involved. And frankly, I also think that when we look at the U.S. Philippines Security Alliance and the Mutual Defense Treaty in particular, we really emphasize the part about, Philippine government and military assets not being attacked, right? But from a territorial perspective, there's language about territorial integrity, right? Maintaining that within the
South
treaty,
China Sea,
right? I don't know that we necessarily view, and this is just my personal opinion, it's not a U.S. government opinion, okay? But I don't think we necessarily view Second Thomas and Scarborough and places like that
as a Philippine territory.
As no, I don't say that. It's de facto controlled by the Philippines. We acknowledge that, and Secretary Pompeo back in 2019
March 1,
said that the territories within the Philippines we're not taking a position on the territories within the EEZs, but the EEZs are legal, right? And they do exist, right? So I think that was a big move. But in terms of
that's a June policy position. I remember.
Right. So, but the territories themselves, I don't think we look at them as sort of integral to maintaining the Philippines as a nation state. Right. And yes, our position from the very beginning is that we don't take a position on who has the right to the territories within the EEZs or within China's 9-dash line or 10-dash line that they're now calling it, based on historical territorial rights. We do not take a position on that.
No, I understand.
So the alliance doesn't really cover it.
Yeah, but the thing is, in the case of Senkaku and DLU, we saw President Obama making a clarification that was not there for quite some time when he visited Tokyo in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, shortly before visiting the Philippines. And actually that hurt our feelings but the reality is that in Japan, they exercise effective and continuous control over those disputed Senkaku DLU islands, at least since the 1970s when the Americans withdrew. So our sense is isn't the Philippines doing the same thing over Tito Island? Isn't the Philippines doing the same thing, for instance? And then you have this tricky double gray zone, right? China using gray zone strategy to threaten the Philippines, and then the Philippines building structures over things that are actually low tide elevation, not even territories to be claimed, like the second Thomas Shoal. You get what I'm saying? So it creates this kind of a legal and operational double gray zone, right? How do you deal with China, and how do you deal also with the Philippines somehow making a territory there? And with this, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that creates a lot of complication, I suppose, in terms of American policy options. Like, from your perspective, what is the optimal way for America to be helpful to the Philippines without necessarily, or unnecessarily rather, provoking or sleepwalking into conflict, for that matter? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of the Senkaku Diaoyu, yeah, you're right. I mean, Japan exercised effective control, so it was kind of easy or easier for us to then say, well, the Mutual Defense Treaty covers the Senkaku Islands, right? And is there an inconsistency in our position? Absolutely there is, right?
Double standard, I would use the word, yeah.
Yes, because, I mean, like you say, Pag-asa, D2 Island, yes, I mean, you already have, you have Filipinos living there.
Since 1970s too, yeah, exactly.
Yes. So that, I would consider that to be de facto control, if not, de jure control of that particular feature. And so why doesn't the Philippines kind of get that same treatment from the United States? And again, it goes back to what are the potential risks for the United States to kind of provide that umbrella level treatment to the Philippines. And I think the risks are, from Washington's perspective, substantially higher, because China, even before the artificial islands, China already had, seized Mischief Reef in 1995, you know what I mean? And so, there was already precedent for China doing these types of things that could potentially draw in the United States. And that's...
Also, you're saying China is more aggressive in the South China Sea than the East China Sea, and also Japan may have more defensive capabilities than the Philippines.
A lot of it is about the latter, yeah.
Right, I mean, we just have to spell it out, right? So in short, a big part of this alliance is U.S. signaling its commitment, but the Philippines also building up its capabilities so that it's an ally that the U.S. feels is more of an asset than liability. I mean, just to spell out, what should be spelled out, right?
We're having a candid conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's absolutely right.
Welcome to Manila. Thank you very much, Derek.
Thank you, Richard.
Grossman, for joining us. That was a great conversation. Really appreciate it. After all, this is about having the unique and honest view on the part of the Philippines.
Yeah. Thank you.
Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Haydarian, and that was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.